Hi boys and girls, today we are going to start our brand new Module 5 for math. This one's all about fractions as numbers and putting them on a number line. Our topic A is to partition our fractions into equal and whole parts. So we're just starting our first lesson. And your job today will be to specify and partition a whole into equal parts and identifying and counting unit fractions using concrete models. That's a lot to take in, so we're going to dig into it together today. So what do we already know about fractions? You know, we've seen them all over. We see them every day. Think about what you already know about fractions, and you can pause this video and take a moment to think. But we're going to keep on going. So we know that fractions are represented in many different ways. We know that we can have them on a number line like this. We can use them in our sets. We can use and see them in our parts of a whole. We can use them on a fraction bar or number line. So there are so many different ways that we can represent our fractions. This is something that is really, really important to remember. So our numerator is the number above this line. So see how there's this little line that separates two numbers? The one on the top is called the numerator. This is very, very, very important to remember because it tells you how many pieces you have. So this tells you the number of pieces that are shaded in or the number of pieces that you have. Whereas the denominator is the number below. So the total number of pieces in your group. So one way I remember the numerator and denominator is with the denominator, it kind of sounds like the basement. So I think of denominator and I think of the word basement and it's the bottom. So I always think of the lower end of my house or my apartment. And I think of the bottom of a number. So that tells me, the denominator tells me the total number. So I can't have any more than there are on the denominator. And the numerator tells me the amount of pieces that I have. Okay, so this is very important to look back, think about it again, and really think about the difference between the numerator and the denominator. All right. So there are so many ways to represent a fraction. We have this chart over here. So we have one whole, one half, 1/3, 1/4. So there are so many different ways that we can represent it. Just like we saw before, we have our number line, we have a picture, we have a number. So we know that it is very important to show that there are 4 equal parts. So whenever we have a fraction, they know that the denominator tells me the number of equal parts and the numerator tells us the number that we count or the number that's shaded in. And we want to make sure we represent these fractions with equal parts. So this is a great equal representation, and this is not a representation for our fraction above. There are 4 equal parts, but they are not equal, okay? So going back to that real quick, we think about if you have a pizza, okay? If you cut it into parts like this, are you going to get an equal slice as your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, or is someone going to have a bigger piece than the others, okay? So we want to make sure, if I love thinking about fractions and I love thinking about them in terms of food and chocolates or whatever you really enjoy eating, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure you have an equal part in the total. So we have our application problem. I want you to think about our math book. Now, we are not able to measure, but I want you to think about your math workbooks that we've used. Think about if you want to measure them in inches or centimeters. Think about the differences between inches or centimeters. And we know which is a larger unit, an inch or a centimeter. Take a minute to think about and remember the difference between our inches and centimeters. Up here, there's a little picture of inches versus centimeters. So if you need a little visual reminder, it's up here. And we know that an inch is a larger unit, so we can measure them with a larger space between each one. And which one would yield a greater number when measuring the book? Which one would have a bigger number when I measure my book? It could be your math book, it could be a notebook. If I were to measure in centimeters or inches, which one would have a bigger number? And the answer is centimeters. I'm going to move myself up here. We know that centimeters have a bigger number because they have tinier units that they're measuring by. So you're going to need more units as you measure. And lastly, measuring two different items with your partner. So as you go home, as you're watching this video, think about two different things. Maybe it's going to be a notebook versus Post-its. So which one would we measure our Post-its with? Which one would we measure our notebook with? And think about how you can go through that. So now we're going to talk about wholes and partitions. So we know that a whole is something whole. It's not divided into smaller parts. So there are no lines that space out this circle, the triangle, the square. It is one whole. And when we partition it, this outside line is a whole, and I break it into 4 different pieces. So it means when you partition it, it means to cut the shapes into parts. So on your work for today, so your assignment for today, you can either print out that first page, or you can just get a normal piece of paper and cut the bottom of it. You want to make sure that you're cutting equal strips. Okay, so again, on our workbook pages today, your job will be to print it out, cut it out, and kind of go with us today. Or you can just use a blank piece of paper that you have. So I want you to think about your paper. Think about measuring and using our inches. How long do you think it is? So take a moment, if you can, measure it. If not, no worries. You can find something else to measure it with. So maybe I'm going to measure it with blocks or Legos or something else that I can find around my house. Now you're going to think about marking the top. So we know that when we have our smaller marks, we know that at the bottom and the top, we're going to have them and kind of break it into half. So if you can space it out into 6 inches, great. If you've cut a piece of paper, fold it in half. So when you're folding it, the line is in the middle and you are making a perfect, so if I were folding it, I'm looking at the top, I'm seeing how my paper is folded correctly up top, and I can fold it directly in half like that. So my paper has already been equaled out on either side. So now if you split it in half, how many parts do you have? So if I have one whole Post-it and I break it in half, how many parts do I have? Think about the 2 parts that I have. So I have 2 parts. And we know that the fractional unit is 2 equal parts. So these 2 equal, I know I have 1/2 and the other half. And that's something we are going to get into a little bit more. So as you're going, think about how you break a piece of paper in half or in a little bit more, and think about how these are now halves, because I have 2 parts, so 2 is halves. So like we said before, our fractional unit is the form that you're using. So you're breaking it into halves, into thirds, into fourths. We also have our uniform. Just like we have before, our uniform is when we write out the number. So we have our halves, meaning there are 2 parts, and our uniform will be 1/2, 1/4, 2/3. So this uniform is the written out form, whereas the fractional unit is the number. So we're going to try it out today together. So I here have 1/2. So I have my beaker and half of it is filled with water. Now for my next one, I see 1/4. How can I know where 1/4 is? So this is super important when I'm looking at my parts because I want to make sure that all the parts are equal. Just like before, if this is some juice, I want to make sure I have the same amount of juice as my 3 siblings. So think about, I'm going to first break it in half. So I know there are 2 parts. After I break it in half, I'm going to break that half in half again to make sure I have the part that I want. So I have half and I break that half in half again and I now have 4 equal parts. So if my part is the 1, we know that the total number, the denominator, is 4th. So I have 1 part that I get, but there are 4 of us total, so that tells me how many parts I need. So I'm going to shade in 1/4, which is 1 part that's shaded in out of 4. So my numerator tells me what I shade in. My denominator tells me the amounts of parts that I have. And this last one over here, I see, again, it could be me and my 2 other friends. So there are 3 of us total. And I want a piece of cake. So I see that 1 part is mine, but I have to share it between 3 people. So the total amount is 3. So we divide our total beaker into 3 equal parts. And of course, I shade in 1 part because that's how many I have. So we're going to keep practicing with this, but it's just a little review about our unit form versus our other forms. Okay, so we have our unit form and our fractional form right over here. I'm going to move me down to the bottom. So for our unit form, think about the total number of parts I have in my strip. Now, I know that there are 3 parts, so my denominator must be thirds. Then I have 1 part that is shaded in. So I have my numerator, which is my shaded part of 1, out of 3 total parts. So my unit form would be 1/3, and my fractional unit would be written like this. Just like we saw before, I have this numerator as 1, meaning 1 that's shaded in, and another one, my denominator, as 3 with 3 total parts as the strip was broken into. Now take a moment, pause, and think about what this next one would be. I have 1, I'm going to count my total numbers first. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces. So my denominator must be 6. And I see that 1 part is shaded in here, so I know that I get 1 piece out of 6. So I could write 1/6 or my fractional unit as 1/6. So that is how we're going to look at it and kind of see how we break it into pieces as well as a shaded part as well. So our last one here, I'm going to do it a little bit quicker. You can pause the video and think about it and then come back to this video. I see, again, 1, 2, 3, 4 parts as my denominator, and I see 1 is shaded in. So I know that there is 1/4 or 1/4 pieces that I could write it in for my unit form and my fractional unit. So boys and girls, today your job is going to be to go to our, let's present this, to our fractional strips, okay? So you're going to, you can cut these out if you have a printer. If you do not have a printer, again, take a piece of paper and you can break it, make sure all your pieces are the same. Your job for today is going to be to make all of these parts. So just like we did with our unit form and our fractional unit, you want to think about how many parts are shaded in. And if I were to shade in 1 part, what would my unit form and my fractional unit look like? So I see I have one whole right here, then I can break one whole into two pieces. I can break it into 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and so on. So your job is going to be to label your fraction strips. Okay, so you can cut this out if you have a printer. If you do not, you can write it on a blank piece of paper, but make sure when you're cutting straight across and you're keeping your pieces the same length. Okay? After that, you're going to try your exit ticket. Okay, so your job will be to do our fraction strips and kind of to label them, and then you're going to be doing our exit ticket. So today, this is your math job, and if you have any questions, I know it was a lot to take in, but if you have any questions, please let your teacher know. We're going to continue to work through this, and this is just the start of a really fun unit.